Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're diving into the life of an absolute legend of North American history. Now, a lot of the time, we just picture Sitting Bull as this famous battlefield victor, right? The guy who famously defeated Custer. But man, the historical record shows a story that is so much more fascinating than just that. We're talking about a strategic genius, a deeply spiritual guide, and a really complex leader who literally spent his entire life trying to navigate this totally unstoppable, expanding industrial force.
And, it's a debate historians are still having today. Was he the last great Native American chief, standing as a final bulwark against Western expansion? Or was his cause kind of doomed from the start just by the sheer weight of modernization? Okay, let's dive into this and uncover the man behind the myth.
Part 1. The making of a chief. So, to really get Sitting Bull, we've got to look at his dual identity.
Right from the get-go, he wasn't just trained to be a fierce warrior, he was actually groomed to be a deeply spiritual leader too. Born in the 1830s into a noble Hunkapah Lakota family as Jumping Badger, he actually made his first kill by age 10. I mean, wow. By 14, he knocks a rival Crow warrior off his horse with a tomahawk, which is what actually earned him the name Sitting Bull from his father. Then fast forward to 1856, he achieves the revered spiritual status of a sacred man. And by 1869, his people recognized his absolute, unmatched dedication to their independence, and an unprecedented coalition of tribes elected him head chief of the Sioux Confederation. He basically rapidly leveled up from a young buffalo hunter to the unified leader of this massive alliance.
Part 2. The spear becomes the shield. Now, as we roll into the 1860s, Sitting Bull's style of leadership had to fundamentally shift.
For years, he'd been the aggressive spear of his people, expanding their territory, leading war parties. But the contrast of the New World was becoming incredibly stark. On one hand, you have the traditional Lakota way of life, which is entirely reliant on the roaming buffalo herds of the Great Plains. On the other hand, you have the Washichu expansion. And just think about the sheer scale of this demographic threat for a second. We're talking hundreds of thousands of European immigrants pouring in every year, fueled by the push for transcontinental railroads, and accelerated by these super-aggressive gold prospectors.
This wasn't just an army marching in. It was a devastating ecological and cultural invasion. Settlers were bringing in new diseases and alcohol. The U.S. government started building these permanent military forts deep within Lakota territory. And honestly, perhaps the biggest blow of all, the settlers' livestock started eating and destroying the precious prairie grass that the wild buffalo absolutely needed to survive. So the huge takeaway here is that stripping away a population's land and resources is often way deadlier than actually fighting them in combat. Sitting Bull was essentially forced to pivot toward a defensive coalition purely to keep his people alive.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how Sitting Bull possessed this absolute, almost unbelievable psychological fearlessness. Let me give you an example. During a battle at Arrow Creek in 1872 against Northern Pacific Railway engineers, he decided he wanted to show total defiance. So he calmly walks out into the middle of the open, highly contested plains, sits down, lights his pipe, and calls out, "Who other Indians with the smoke with me come?" While enemy bullets are literally whistling past his head and hitting the dirt all around him, he just sits there. He finishes his tobacco, cleans his pipe, and then, cool as a cucumber, just walks back to his lines. It is a completely cinematic moment of pure psychological warfare.
Part 3. Vision at Little Bighorn. So naturally, this intense psychological warfare soon escalated into a totally chaotic climax. Backing up just a bit to the mid-1870s, the U.S. government was aggressively pushing to mine gold in the sacred Black Hills. Sitting Bull flat out refused to sell the land, and that sparked the Great Sioux War. Now, to really grasp what happens next, we have to remember his status as a Wicasa Wakan, a sacred man. And the spiritual authority wasn't just handed to him, right? To attain it, he had to undergo this brutal Sundance sacrifice where his chest and back muscles were literally skewered and he was hung in the air until he tore himself loose. Just incredibly intense physical sacrifice. But because of that, his spiritual authority was absolute. When Sitting Bull said he had a vision, his people listened with total, complete reverence.
So with the U.S. military closing in during the summer of 1876, Sitting Bull completes 4 days of those sacred rites, and suddenly he's struck by a profound vision. He sees enemy soldiers falling upside down right into his camp. To Sitting Bull and his followers, this was a clear mythic prophecy. A massive victory was about to fall right into their laps.
And, well, that prophecy definitely came true, largely thanks to Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer made 3 absolute tactical blunders here. First, he decided to attack on the afternoon of June 25th, which was a full day earlier than planned. Second, because he rushed in, he went in totally blind. He had zero idea of the massive size of Sitting Bull's war party. And third, he fatally divided his 700-man regiment into 3 separate, completely isolated groups. This gave the unified Lakota and Cheyenne forces the perfect opportunity to just overwhelm them one by one. The result? Utter devastation for the U.S. forces. Nearly half of Custer's entire regiment was either killed or wounded in fierce hand-to-hand combat, and the rest were forced into a panicked retreat. Sitting Bull, who was in his 40s at this point, orchestrated the defense and tended to the wounded. It was hands down the greatest military triumph in their history. But tragically, this monumental Native victory would ironically be the very thing that triggered their ultimate destruction.
Part 4. Starvation and Surrender.
See, winning the Battle of Little Bighorn meant facing the full, vengeful wrath of a really embarrassed American public that was now demanding retribution. The whole tone of the conflict shifted overnight. The U.S. military realized they didn't actually need to defeat Sitting Bull in direct combat if they could just destroy his food supply. Just imagine the desperation here. By 1878, 6,500 Indigenous refugees were forced into this freezing retreat across the border into Canada. The military systematically wiped out the buffalo herds, so they weren't defeated by better tactics or better soldiers, they were defeated by a highly targeted, systemic starvation.
So the crucial point is that by 1881, diplomatic pressures and near total starvation finally forced his hand. Sitting Bull and a small group of loyalists returned to the U.S. and entered Fort Buford in literally rotting clothes. As he handed over his weapon, he said, "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." Even when he was physically beaten down by the elements and having basically no food, he never truly gave up that spirit of resistance.
Part 5, The Final Ghost Dance. Now, in a really bizarre twist of fate, Sitting Bull's final chapter actually saw him touring as a celebrity with Buffalo Bill's Wild West Theater Troupe, and he made a pretty handsome amount of money doing it too. But he eventually returned to the Standing Rock Agency where he begrudgingly learned to farm, raised some cattle and chickens, and really just tried to walk this delicate middle line between the old ways and his new reality. Let's move to the next point and see how this builds. Because just as he was starting to adapt, the government struck with the General Allotment Act of 1887. When you look at the horrific bureaucratic math of this act, it's staggering. It completely broke up the reservations. Native families were suddenly restricted to a maximum of 160 acres. Then, all the remaining millions of acres of so-called surplus land were just sold off to non-native settlers for 50 cents an acre. It was essentially a legal mechanism designed to strip away the very last vestiges of their homeland.
With their land gone and their rations severely cut, a new, desperate spiritual movement started sweeping across the plains, the ghost dance. Prophets were claiming that by doing this dance, Native Americans could actually be transported to a pre-contact paradise, full of buffalo and entirely free of European settlers. Crucially, they believed the dance would magically protect them from bullets. Sitting Bull didn't actually stop his people from dancing, and U.S. authorities, they were absolutely terrified. They thought he was going to use this powerful movement to spark one last massive rebellion.
Now, years earlier, a meadowlark had come to Sitting Bull in a vision, warning him that he would eventually be killed by his own people. And on December 15, 1890, that exact Shakespearean tragedy unfolded. U.S. authorities sent Lakota policemen to arrest him right before dawn. A massive, chaotic crowd gathered outside his cabin. A firefight broke out. A man named Catch the Bear shot a policeman named Bullhead, and as Bullhead fell, he shot Sitting Bull right in the chest, which was immediately followed by a fatal shot to the head from another policeman, Red Tomahawk. And just like that, the greatest of the Sioux chiefs died in the crossfire of his own divided people.
Sitting Bull's life is just this profound epic of resistance, deep spirituality, and fierce leadership. He navigated an era of absolutely devastating change with unmatched courage. But as we reflect on his legacy today, we really have to ask, ultimately, was Sitting Bull defeated by bullets on the battlefield, or was he defeated by the totally unstoppable economics and demographics of industrialization? It's a hugely complex question, but it's one that completely defines the history of the American West. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this leaves you eager to explore even more of this incredibly fascinating history.